Brut, New Art on Stage.
Welcome to the 23rd edition of The Art of Assembly, this time with the title Gathering in the Cloud, Digital Performance Beyond Zoom. And I'm very happy to welcome as my guests Kent Bai, Jaamil Olawale Kosoko and Sarah Rothberg, whom all I will introduce more thoroughly later. My name is Florian Malzacher. I'm the host of this nomadic series of lectures and conversations about the potential of gatherings in art, activism, and politics. And if you have missed it so far, you might want to check out our website and archive, where you find videos and podcasts of the past episodes, as well as lots of other material on the topic, art-of-assembly.net. This podcast is based on an event that took place on April 19th at the metaverse platform Nowhere, which was quite an experience. You might want to have a look at this environment to get a feeling for the slightly strange floating heads we ourselves became during the session. But before we continue with this, I would like to thank very much Kate Machulat and the team from Max Media Art Exploration for the partnership for this edition, and especially Vallejo Gantner and the team of Onyx Studio, as well partners of this edition, who really made all this possible. And of course to Nowhere for hosting us. As so many things, this series was 2.5 years ago, before the beginning of the pandemic, planned as an analog series of events, and then had to take place online for quite a long time. So in many episodes, we were in the paradoxical situation to reflect on physical gatherings, on coming together as bodies, while being unable to actually physically meet. And even though we were meeting digitally on Zoom, we rarely talked about meetings in virtual realms. We basically almost never talked about the condition in which we were meeting ourselves when talking about gatherings. So, and that of course tells something about the fetish of presence nourished by many artists, performance makers, and theater people, as me. And it's obviously overdue to finally ask, where are we now actually, and what digital gatherings in art do exist or will come out of it beyond Zoom? And is the metaverse more than a promise or a threat, as it's mostly described in general, but also very specifically for performing arts? And since I'm quite naive in all this, I'm happy to be joined by people that have much more experience with these questions. The author, performance artist and curator Jaamil Olawale Kosoko will speak about their virtual performance suite Chameleon, the Living Installments, exploring the fugitive realities of living at the intersection of digitality, blackness, and queerness. The interactive media artist Sarah Rothberg will introduce her playful VR, AR experience and talks about the intersection of interactivity and performance. But we will start with Kent Bai, who has published over 1,200 Voices of VR podcast interviews featuring pioneering artists, storytellers, and technologists driving the resurgence of virtual and augmented reality. He is an oral historian, experimental journalist, and aspiring philosopher, helping to define the patterns of immersive storytelling, experiential design, ethical frameworks, and the ultimate potential of XR. Kent, you will offer a brief overview of virtual gatherings art tonight, and I'm really happy you are here, since I learned a lot from your podcasts, and it's obviously quite an impressive number. 1,200 episodes is far more than we have or ever will have with the Art of Assembly. Thanks so much for joining, and the floor is yours.
My name is Kent Bai, and I've been doing the Voices of VR podcast for almost 9 years now, and I'm going to be talking about today VR presence and live immersive performance trends. Yeah, since May of 2014, I've been going to over 100 different events, talking to really people across the entire industry, from arts and science and immersive storytelling, entertainment, medical applications, architects, industrial enterprise applications. And so trying to get a sense of what the affordances of the VR medium are and where it's going in the future. And so I'm going to be talking today about a quick primer of presence in VR, and then going over some VR performance trends. And so let's dive into the presence in VR. So when you talk about VR, the thing that makes it different is that you actually feel present in a place. So when I think about virtual reality, I think about it in terms of ways that you can express your active presence, mental and social presence, emotional presence, and embodied and environmental presence. And this is not only just in virtual reality, but it's also in, say, all of reality, that you're experiencing all these different dimensions at the same time. But you can look at it through the mediated lens of looking at, say, the video games and interactivity and agency. It's all about expressing your will in terms of the active presence. The mental and social presence is a lot about how we use language to communicate with other people through social media, through literature, the way we do narration, or we just use the computer to kind of surf the information highway of the internet. Then we have emotional presence, where you have the medium of film, which is all about kind of building, releasing tension and trying to modulate your emotions. And you can say, look at the mediums of music and lighting, and also film, that is, kind of the mediums where we're kind of more passively receiving a story. And then you have the embodied and environmental presence, where you have a lot of where VR is adding this new sensory and embodied component, but we've had dimensions of that environmental and embodied context in the context of theater, but also in architecture and dance. And so with virtual reality, we're kind of combining all of these things together. So again, it's about taking action, making choices, emotional immersion, and sensory experiences. And so we can take a look at another way of looking at the progression of media, of how each subsequent new medium is kind of encapsulating all the affordances of the previous medium. So we go from oral storytelling to theater to books, film, radio, TV, video games, internet, mobile phone. And when we get to virtual and augmented reality, we're really integrating all these other previous media into ways that we can kind of look at each of these different affordances. And they're kind of color-coded to the different affordances and in center of gravity. Like, for example, video games is all about agency, the internet, mobile phone, a lot about this kind of communication element. And then virtual and augmented reality, you see, is really about this embodied and environmental presence. So we've all had this experience during the pandemic of using Zoom, but we don't have this sense of embodiment or agency. It's really a platform where it's one-to-many broadcast, and you don't have much choice to kind of like have these side conversations. And so as we've moved into these virtual platforms, like here at Nowhere, you have the ability to kind of move around and recreate the dimension of what I see is really magical about these kind of gatherings, or the hallway conversations, where you can really choose where to go and kind of like have these self-organizing conversations like a cocktail party, but you really have a lot more embodied agency in that context. When I started to see a lot of the translation of virtual conferences into VR during the beginning of the pandemic, there was some, like IEEE VR, where they did have the ability to locomote around, but the challenge with these virtual conferences is that you can teleport around. So it kind of takes away the need for those hallways. But a lot of these conferences also were deprioritizing the hallway experience, and they were just focusing on, say, broadcasting the lectures, which at that point you really only needed Zoom. And so I feel like it's like platforms like Nowhere, I think, is trying to recreate that sort of dimensions of have those serendipitous collisions. But I could do a whole talk just on what I've seen in the art of gathering and conferences, but today I'm going to be mostly focusing on performances. A lot of my work actually is going into these conferences and doing these interviews in the context of the hallway. And that's still yet something that's not really quite been fully replicated in the virtual context. But anybody who's in the theater scene is probably well familiar with the immersive theater, things like Sleep No More that launched in New York City in 2011, where you start to have, as an audience, you're more of a passive ghost. You're not having any interactivity in how the story unfolds, but you at least have the choice of where to go within the context of the building, and you can trace different storylines that are unfolding. And so in 2017, we started to see the interface between this kind of one-on-one immersive theater experiences and virtual reality, where you have a actor that's acting, but you see this kind of penciled out representation of this experience. And so I'll be diving into the many different iterations of this kind of fusion of the theater world and the virtual reality world that I've seen in the festival circuit. But this is kind of like one of the first examples that I started to see. So, all right, so I'm going to dive into the performance trends. I'm going to start by looking into the context of these qualities of presence. So starting with the emotional presence. So this is a little bit more passive experiences that we're watching and kind of really focusing on the story elements. I wanted to highlight Love Seat that I saw at Venice in 2019, because this was a theatrical performance where you had a live audience that was watching it, but they were also in virtual reality and performing a whole other aspect. And so you have this second screen capability where you see an additional context of what's happening in the virtual context of what they're doing in these virtual spaces, but also see their physical embodiment and some of their facial expressions. The thing to note here is that in order to pull this off, they actually had to have two completely different production crews. The production crews to handle all of the live performance elements of a theatrical performance, but also all this sort of online performance. And as time has gone on, I've seen more and more aspects of, say, this dual production where they have a physical component and a virtual component that increases the accessibility, but also kind of doubles the workload. So the Under Presents was a piece that was it's an open world exploration puzzle game, but there are these moments where you go into this certain part of the game and you have the opportunity to engage with some live immersive theater actors who kind of take you on these variety of different adventures. And so we started to see, actors being able to work from home while it's being in this kind of immersive theater production that was going around like basically 24/7. Then they translated a lot of that same platform of the Under Presents into a production of The Tempest that happened in 2020. And you're really using the virtual reality affordances to kind of take you on this wild adventure, but again, having like one actor that's kind of guiding you through this entire experience. And the audience here is kind of more muted and they have embodied interactions, but they're not able to actually speak. So Dream was a production that was a part of the Audience for the Future, Royal Shakespeare Company and Marshmallow Laser Feast, that starting to look at this interface of how to use these immersive technologies like Unreal Engine and motion capture to be able to puppeteer different characters and have different types of embodiment. And there was kind of a tiered system here where you could either just watch the live stream video, you could have an embodied Firefly interaction where you have some lightweight interaction, but no real meaningful interaction, but also getting some insights from behind the scenes. And so starting to use this kind of motion capture technology into more of these theatrical productions that have kind of a tiered approach for how deep you want to be able to engage with the piece. So moving into the mental and social presence, we have Teach Live was an educational application where you actually have one actor who is puppeteering 5 different students. And it was really a training for teachers, but this idea of Wizard of Oz where you have one actor who's kind of jumping in between multiple characters is a technique that you start to see a lot within these immersive theater plays, especially in the context of virtual reality. So this is starting in 2005, but has since been evolving. Starship Commander Arcade is not a theatrical performance. It's more of this idea that you could start to have this branching narrative and conversational interfaces where you're speaking in and using artificial intelligence to be able to engage with the narrative. It originally had aspirations to start to use what would it look like to be in a video game where you're using diplomacy as a key game mechanic, but they had to move into more of an arcade context, which was more of a shooter-up type of experience and less about kind of exploring the nuances of the frontiers of conversational interfaces. But it's worth noting that I think a lot of the kind of the future is starting with immersive theater actors who are live, and then eventually, trying to think about, well, what dimensions of that kind of live interaction can be translated into more of a non-player character or artificial intelligence, where we're really at this intersection of AI and the future of these interactive media, where you can start to have a little bit more complicated or branching narratives. Avenues was a training application where it was really for Child Protective Services, and you were trying to do the screening as to whether or not you should take a child away from these parents, and have different branches. And for me, I chose to take the child away, and it ended up being a really powerful narrative component where really this heart-wrenching moment where you as a character are taking a child away from parents. But the idea here is just that there's these kind of branches that you have. And so with these virtual platforms, you have a little bit more leeway to get into more complicated narrative structures than we've seen in traditional immersive theater pieces that tend to have a little bit more on rails, like one narrative line. Elsinore was a piece that's really driven by, in the back end, really complicated planning artificial intelligence, where each decision you make is changing how the unfolding structure is going to unfold. It's a looping narrative where you're kind of playing a secondary character in Hamlet, Elsinore, and you're trying to achieve a certain goal of trying to basically change the fates of Hamlet. And so it's a piece that it has this, each choice that you're making actually changes the dimension of how the story is unfolding. So these types of more complicated narrative structures that are driven by more sophisticated artificial intelligence, I think, is one of the affordances of these virtual platforms that you don't tend to get when you get into live immersive theater. Dr. Crumb's School of Disobedient Pets is an example of an escape game where you have a kind of an actor who's helping give this narrative arc to these different interactions. And again, there's a Wizard of Oz component where one actor is embodying many different characters over the course of this piece. Mandala was a piece that showed at Venice in 2022, and this was a group experience. We have 6 different people going through this group discussion. And the thing that was interesting about this is that there's certain moments where they're kind of split into 3 different colors, 2 each. And so you'd have to have basically a majority vote of, or at least half of the people voting to take an action, and based upon those different actions, then that would change the way that the narrative would unfold. So this idea of how do you start to distribute agency out to a group dynamic? So Mandala is starting to explore that to some degree. Then we get into active presence, where you get into like Finding Pandora X, which was in a platform of VR chat. And so you're able to actually make these different choices, branching into one direction or the next. And this is another example of an immersive theater piece that really had this kind of like social dynamic where they were kind of communicating with the entire audience the whole time, continuing on these different discussions. But for me, the highest level of agency that I've seen in a immersive theater piece was called Meta Movie Project Alien Rescue, where you actually become a protagonist. And there's four other immersive theater actors who are helping guide you through this whole adventure. And they have a bit of a secondary kind of iBots who are kind of have the freedom to kind of roam around and follow the action and make different choices. And actually, they've moved from one hero into 4 different heroes. So for each main character, there's a kind of an audience member who's paired up. So you have all these kind of emergent dynamics of different choices that are made throughout the course of this, given the different alignments and allegiances for each of the characters and how they're interacting. So the Meta Movie Project is probably, for me, this kind of blending of live action role play into immersive theater in the virtual worlds. Flying Wheelie was just at South by Southwest. And this is an example where they have this kind of open world exploration where you can go into different alleyways, and they have these different tools that you're supposed to be kind of recapturing memories. So it's covering different themes of memory and surveillance, but you kind of have this dynamic where the audience is set off into this open world exploration and then brought back. And so you have this overall narrative thread, but this kind of like releasing of the cats and the herding of the cats throughout the course of this piece, which I thought was a really interesting dynamic. And then embodied environmental presence, Draw Me Close, I mentioned, where you have this kind of mother and child relationship. The mother's dying of cancer, and you have this kind of heartfelt hug that happens in the course of this piece that ends up being this kind of passive haptic feedback where you feel another character touching you in the context of VR, where you're transported into this virtual realm, but you're actually getting this feedback that this character is real and right there with you. And so that's a really powerful experience that's starting to explore these different dynamics of kind of blending the virtual and the real. Believe Your Eyes was a piece that was by Punch Drunk, and it was a 360 video. And you're kind of spinning around, seeing different scenes within the context of the 360 video, but they have these immersive theater actors who are kind of giving, again, touching you and giving this haptic feedback that's connecting you to the physical reality, but also giving you this plausibility that what's happening in this virtual space is actually happening. This is also a piece that they do a lot of really sophisticated aspects of the onboarding and the offboarding that are also starting to blur different dimensions of reality, creating this magic circle that kind of continues before and after you have this experience. The Collider was a piece where they have the asymmetry of one person's in virtual reality and the other person is not in VR. And so you have these different interactions where one person's kind of puppeteering the other person, exploring these different power dynamics. And again, you have this audio kind of introduction into this piece. It's evoking different aspects of your memories as they're asking you to remember different times where you've either had power over someone, or someone else has had power over you. And so you have these asymmetry interactions that they're exploring. And then at the end, they have this debriefing where you're able to ask and go through a series of questions, kind of unpacking what each person was able to experience in the context of this piece. A really, really powerful piece. Exploring Helm was by Sarah Lisa Vogel, and she's using virtual worlds to be able to express different dimensions of her identity. And so you're able to go through these different virtual worlds, exploring different dimensions. You're listening to what she's saying, but also able to embody different avatars that are expressing different dimensions of her own mixed race background and different complications that she's experienced of racism and whatnot throughout the course of her life. And so this is a piece that is like translating this person's journey into these virtual worlds that you're exploring. Wolves on the Wall is an experience where, third rail projects, Then She Fell. They're taking these dimensions of these embodied interactions that immersive theater actors have, and they're doing motion capture and basically creating an interactive virtual being character that's taking the lessons that they learned to this immersive theater piece and putting it into this nonverbal communications with this virtual being. One of the most sophisticated kind of interactions and subtle aspects of these embodied sort of nonverbal interactions that you have with these virtual characters. So another example of how the lessons of these immersive theater actors have thousands and thousands of hours of interacting with different humans and understanding the essence of human behavior and translating that into virtual reality. The last couple here, so Gilles Jobin had these experiments with live dance that was showing at like Venice Film Festival and other festivals as well. And so this is and how do you convey the liveness of a live? If there's live performance in a virtual context, how do you know it's not just like a pre-recorded thing? They started to try to put on the wall like a live stream, but the live stream had such delay that was difficult to kind of trace the agency that it was actually happening live. So this is kind of a dilemma when you're not co-located. How do you know that a live performance is actually happening live in the virtual context? And I guess a solution to that is something like Dazzle that I saw at Venice, where you're actually able to interact dynamically with some of the different actors or with the dancers and actually have sort of a co-located dance in physical space, but also have these virtual representations. So that's kind of a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the different dimensions. And there's so much more that's happening. And I've done hundreds of different interviews, but that's to give you some sense of the different qualities of presence, of active presence, mental and social presence, emotional presence, and body presence. And yeah, just kind of a review of some of the different dimensions of presence and also some of the performance trends I've seen. So yeah, I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kent. That was quite a run through a lot of material. For those who want to get a recap or get deeper into some of these aspects, there's a lot of links on our website. And we will come now to our second guest. I'm very happy that you're here, Sarah. Sarah Rothberg is an interactive media artist creating playful, poetic, usually a bit weird experiences that invite you to reconsider your relationship to the world around you. These take many forms, ranging from performance to VR, AR, installation, video, writing, and workshops. Sarah is currently an assistant professor at the Interactive Telecommunications program at NYU's Tisch School for the Arts, and she works on the collaborative projects Investing in Futures, a participatory framework for imagining changed worlds, and Is This Thing On?, a post-Web 2 experiment in artist-driven live streaming. And your performance New Meetings is, of course, in many ways dealing with exactly the questions we want to talk about today, investigating, quote, how new media changes how we connect. And in a way, it's a laboratory, a set of experiments. So I'm very curious what you will offer in terms of rethinking gatherings and assemblies. And the floor is yours.
First of all, thank you all so much for having me here. So I am an interactive media artist, and I'm also a person who teaches interactive media. And one of the things that I am constantly thinking about is how the design choices made in a virtual environment impact the way that we can exist inside of them, and also reflect the ideology of what they were sort of built for and within the world that they were built within. I want you to think about, all of these different kinds of platforms that I'm going to talk about having created in, and what they might say or encourage, what they might reflect about the kind of environment that they were built in, and what kind of behaviors they encourage. And that is kind of the subject of my art practice and also what I teach. So just to give you a little bit of context about myself, this is like a very deep-rooted interest in mine. I like to tell people that I grew up on AOL chat rooms. Like, I spent almost all of my time in those as, even before I was a teenager. And I found that what I could do in chat rooms as kind of like a troll or play a character really expanded my understanding of how technology kind of affects the way we communicate, and also how those affordances or those things built into the platforms are the places that we can intervene in when making artwork. So this became not only a fascination in terms of using technology as an artistic medium, but also oftentimes the work that I produce asks my audience to kind of engage with thinking about their connection to these technologies also. So I won't get too much into these kind of older pieces, but for me, that started because I was interested in chat rooms through text as a poet. So like I was obsessed with Google Docs when it first came out as like a collaborative tool. And a collaborative live real-time performance tool. I really loved to collaborate with the auto transcription on my phone. And I became also very interested in the phone as this creative tool, specifically when we started to have video on the phone. So me and my collaborators of mine, this was when I was like in my 20s, this was like a long time ago. We were really interested in this thing that kept happening with phones where you meant, I'm sure everyone remembers this, you mean to take a picture and instead you take a video. Can I get some like head nods? So we decided to hold this film festival. I got a bunch of people jumping. That was so cute. Okay, so you know, you mean to take a picture, but instead you take a video and you end up with all these videos where people are just like, oops, I'm taking a video. So we decided to have like a film festival of those. So we had this, we called it the Incidental Film Festival, but at the time, and we thought it was this cute kind of interesting personal connection to things. But this was in Oakland in 2011. And one of the reasons I'm just so honored to be invited to this Art of Assembly is like so many of my political all-star thinkers are on this Art of Assembly podcast. So thank you again for inviting me to that, because it was this moment that I understood that the camera technology was also a political tool, and not just a political tool because you could capture you know, different injustices happening, but you could also mobilize people through the use of live stream and broadcast. So what ended up happening is we were, me and my collective were meaning to host this Incidental Film Festival. And instead we realized this is actually an event that has to do with technology as a political action tool. So, and this for me was kind of also the entry point into thinking about how can you make something which is invitational, which is friendly, which is welcoming and warm and personal, and as connected to these larger systemic and oftentimes even politically fraught kind of questions. So, you know, I continued working with video for a long time. These are just some like goofy experiments of like trying to do head-mounted camera experiments. And especially because I was really interested in how memory and technology kind of have this like strange feedback loop. So obviously it used to be that you take a photo and then you have that photo, it's not connected inherently to any kind of corporate platform. But as someone who grew up pretty much with Facebook, since, you know, I was like one of the first group of people that got Facebook, I started to realize that Facebook was using this kind of attachment, or this kind of like way of using nostalgia as kind of a marketing tool for its own platform. And that became really kind of scary and upsetting to me. So I was doing all these experiments thinking about that. And it just so happened that that was the year that Facebook bought Oculus. These are not words people use anymore, but I think maybe you all remember what those words mean. So for me, I was like, oh, maybe I need to think about VR. Maybe I want to get into thinking about VR and what does that mean? So that kind of launched me into this journey where I was trying to make work that examined what the potential future impact of VR might be, especially through the lens of the corporate platforms that kind of control and own it. So in this case, I won't get into this work, but this is like the first VR work that I made called Memory Place, which was using my own home videos to reconstruct the house that I grew up in, but they were like littered with these like random Facebook advertisements. So a little on the nose, a little cheesy, but what can I say? I was just in grad school at that time. So I continued working with VR for a long time. And I'm sure Kent, maybe you remember, but VR in the beginning was like a very lonely place. Like you couldn't do multiplayer stuff in there for a long time. So a lot of my work was kind of like commentary on
what's an action without a consequence?
So this was a piece called Touching a Cactus, and it was a sort of poetic connection to thinking about these moments of the virtual and the real and what exists and what has impact and what doesn't. But they were all very much like meditations. What I realized is a few things from doing that. I didn't like putting other people in a headset in my artwork. And at the same time, I wanted to remain on the side. VR is very seductive as an artist. Like it's very seductive to make an entire world and make all of the rules and make all of the environment and make all of the vibe. But I didn't want to lose sight of the fact that VR is also something to think of from a critical perspective. So I thought, how can I make work which allows me to explore VR, talk about VR, and use all of this like huge number of skills that I've built making VR over the past few years. And that's when I turned to looking at VR as a performance tool. So this was my first experiment with that. It was called the New News. And in the New News, I'm inhabiting this avatar in front of a real audience, but it's a speculative future where I'm wearing a VR headset and doing a fictional VR broadcast to a fictional audience that I can't in real life see the people around me. And it was like very disorienting and kind of opened up this avenue for me of thinking of VR and the headset as a tool for performance and thinking about interactivity as performance in general. So this is kind of what that piece looked like. And I show it because this is a technique that I still use really often in my work, which is just a really fast way to do motion capture, but has the added affordance of being a space that I'm actually immersed in. So I did work like that for quite some time, and even thought about how in my installation work, I could think of the user as a type of performer. So this was a piece called Water Without Wet, where the user is performing these kinds of repetitive actions. And from the outside, there are two screens that show the results of those actions in these kind of recombinatory generative landscapes. But the person inside the headset can never really see their impact on the outside world. So that was like my little metaphorical exploration of user and spectator. But again, all of these worlds, they felt very isolated. There's only ever one person in them. And, finally it became sort of more possible to build these collaborative worlds. Specifically, I like really loved VR chat because it was so fucking weird there. I don't know. Has anyone spent time in VR chat? Yeah, it's pretty unhinged. I don't know what's going on in there right now, but the reason that I bring that up is, there was this obvious connection between the horrible shutdown of, physical spaces in 2020. And it seemed that there should be this really wonderful connection between that and this like moment of VR, like having its like heyday of multiplayer, gathering spaces. And I would say in some ways it has, and in some ways it hasn't. I think really often about this moment with one of my students, we decided to watch that Meta VR announcement. And, it was like mid-pandemic, I think. And we're watching it, and this is a student who wasn't really into VR, and she's watching this like specific clip where there's this guy playing chess with his like virtual chess counterpart. And she just looks at me and she's like, why does anybody want this? And I was like, that is such a good question. Like, what is the world that needs to be happening around this where this is for some reason the thing that you want? So that's a question I like to keep in mind and sort of influence the next bout of work that I started to make. I'm just being cognizant of the time, so I'm just going to speed ahead a little bit. But one of the pieces that Florian was referring to that actually first debuted in Onyx Studio, so shout out to Onyx for that, was a piece called New Meetings that sort of wrapped together a bunch of different kinds of threads, thinking about virtual gathering space, the move to just being online in general. What does it mean what kind of social technologies emerged at that time? So I don't know if anyone else was teaching on Zoom for the entirety of the pandemic, but a lot of really interesting, I would say, social technologies emerged. So especially in response to, I think, the like political uprisings in 2020, people realized that in combination with being on Zoom all the time, people realized that they needed a different way to be able to talk to each other. And there was a rise, specifically I noticed, of people making like really concerted efforts to set the tone of how they would want to speak to each other in a meeting. And this came through many, many different channels. Specifically, the first time I had participated in what a group agreement was in Anti-Racist Educators Network. And a group agreement, jump if you've done a group agreement before. Oh my goodness, nobody. Okay, a few people. So a group agreement is when you first get to a group of people, how do you sort of decide how it is that you want to interface with each other? And obviously this has nothing to do with like technology in a digital platform sense, but somehow in my point of view, the rise of, Zoom as the way we're interfacing with each other, as well as in conjunction with like all of this like political revolution happening at the same time, made that this like kind of interesting social norm in terms of how you meet each other online. So that plus the metaverse plus just kind of wanting to like talk to people for the first time in a long time led me to make this piece called New Meetings. So New Meetings, I like to call it a performance of meetings about whatever. So in New Meetings, me and a person who is unknown to me meet inside of this virtual world that I constructed specifically for this purpose. And we're both inhabiting an avatar, kind of like I showed in the new news. But the trick is, and it's live streamed as 2D content. The trick of it is that the more you talk, the higher up you get raised on a platform. And in order to end the meeting, you both have to get to the top. So let me show you an example. So this is sort of what the like far shot looks like. So each meeting opens with trying to come to a consensus. What is this meeting going to be about? How are we going to talk to each other? But some people who I've done this performance with were incredibly good at like sharing space or taking turns. Some people I really had to like goad responses out of. Some people totally monopolized the conversation and I had to sort of like keep interrupting them to catch up to get to the top. So that way we could exit the meeting. And I'll play, how is video working in here? Is it okay? I'm going to play a video and see how, all right, super. So this is just a clip of New Meetings.
Usually at the beginning of the meeting, I like to ask, if there's anything you want to like agree on for how our meeting could work. So for instance, like I would like our meeting to be one where, you talk and then I talk and we like listen to each other and add, build on what each other is saying.
I'm game for that. I think meetings in general always have these directions, there's agendas, there's a run of show. I think in this case, I'm excited to understand that if I'm an avatar and I don't know you, you don't know me, what other kinds of conversations we might have.
Usually at the beginning of the meeting.
All right, so I'll just skip forward. I hear someone talking who's not from my video, but that's totally cool. I think someone trolling me. Okay, so anyway, that's this piece, New Meetings. Basically, you have to get to the end. You have to touch the ball of the meeting, and then you're allowed to suggest some kind of, rule of engagement for the next person who may or may not accept that. So I see I'm just about running out of time, so I'm just going to skip ahead to talk about a little bit of what I'm working on now. So all of this work has sort of been like as an artist on my own doing this work, maybe with two people, but I haven't actually been able to like build alternatives to these ways of working that I'm constantly engaging with and critiquing, which are like these big tech approaches to virtual gathering spaces. But fortunately, I've come to a group of collaborators recently. We call ourselves Is This Thing On? And we've been building this kind of like wacky artist first live stream network. And we like to say we're building a platform against the logic of big tech. So what does that mean? So the other artists on the platform, they're all live streamers as well, or at least interested in experimenting with live stream. And each step of the way, we try to make some aspect of the platform and then have a debrief and check in about like, do we want this? Is this cool? Does this suck? And because we've been fortunate to be funded by artist grants, we really don't have to think about like, what's the bottom line of this work? So I like to say that it's an experiment in software development as performance itself. So what does it mean to actually develop the software in the same way, with the same kind of care and attention that it takes to make an artwork?
Thank you so much, Sarah. And now I'm very happy to welcome Jaamil Olawale Kosoko, a performance artist and curator with a conceptual, process-based and interdisciplinary practice. They move across the creative realms of live art performance, video, sculpture, and poetry, using both cultural and academic idioms. As an educator and community organizer, they approach politics and education as extensions of their creative practice. through rooted ritual and spiritual practice, embodied poetics, Black critical studies, and queer theories of the body. Jaamil conjures and crafts perpetual modes of freedom, healing, and care when, where, and however possible. And tonight you will focus on your work, Chameleon, which I'm very much looking forward to, because in this you also describe, reflect, and archive your experience of having to shift from a work that is planned analog during the pandemic to the digital world.
Thank you all so much for this incredible invitation and opportunity to share some of the American Chameleon project. I won't be going through a kind of repertoire of my pieces. That would take far too long, I think, but I do hope to do a bit of a deep dive into this Chameleon project. So from its original inception in 2018 as a live performance that would have premiered at New York Live Arts in Manhattan in the spring of 2020, the Chameleon Project had already been designed as a transformative conceptual apparatus that could withstand varying environmental conditions. However, what I could not have planned for was the global crisis that would necessitate the need to position this conceptual framework into action. And so what we have here, this image, is from the what was to be promotional material for the Chameleon project that would take place at New York Live Arts on April 8th through 11th, 2020. That did not happen as I had intended. I oftentimes refer to American Chameleon as an archive of a performance that never happened, or at least that never happened as I had intended for it to. And then this is some of the promotional material that was offered through Impact, the Experimental Media Performing Arts Center in upstate New York, just outside of Troy, where I had the opportunity, was grateful to be in residence with Impact from, I believe, 2018 through 2020. So it was a significant 3-year commitment from Impact to support my work, my thinking, and to essentially help me bridge a gap between what was happening inside of the digital realm and the concepts that I was trying to bring forth inside of my creative work. Chameleon is a derivative of all of the projects that came before it. Hashtag Negrophobia, Seancers, all were projects that sort of helped to culminate into what became American Chameleon, the Living Installments. Something that feels really important to me as I am making work is this idea of how am I inviting folks into the project, into the process. So my dear colleague and friend, Ada M. Patterson, was writing about my work. I invited to write about my work. And this is a practice that I've been in for many years, of just sort of inviting folks to be alongside me, alongside my thinking, to be sort of thinking partners, and to engage in a kind of writing exchange about the kind of cultural production that is coming off the work that I'm producing. And so just alongside of the development of Chameleon, of course, there was Hurricane Dorian. And so Ada M. Patterson wrote some beautiful text And I'll just share some of it. Kosako's Chameleon came to me while the likes of Hurricane Dorian came to the Caribbean. I didn't have many words for what was happening. I could only find words wanting to make it stop. Kosako's work in one eye with the other eye staring into the eye of the hurricane. Chameleon is a reminder that we don't have to stay where we are as queered, vulnerable bodies living precarious lives. Ada talks a lot around themes of being queered by certain environments or being queered by catastrophe. Is a line of thinking that they've been researching. And so right alongside the making of Chameleon, I was thinking alongside the work of Christina Sharp, her incredible book In the Wake on the Blackness and of on the Blackness of and on Blackness and Being. There's a really important question. There's very many important questions that she's evoking, but one that stood out to me particularly was this notion: what does it mean to defend the dead, to tend to the Black dead and dying, to tend to the Black person, to Black people, always living in the push toward our death? So this is a question that really has haunted me, I think, all my life, actually. And so to hear her and to read her really articulating some of this was very important to me as someone who has experienced quite a bit of familial death, immediate family members transitioning all throughout childhood, teenage years, and adulthood. I oftentimes say that I've been sort of forced into a very intimate relationship with death. And so this is an personal archival footage of my grandmother that is also featured in Chameleon, a visual album. And sort of asking this question that I thought was just sort of provocative, but or making this statement that I thought was particularly evocative during this performance: "You may lose your kin." And this was a very real statement that it seemed to really register and take on a different meaning, particularly inside of the pandemic. And so this led me to the work of the Collective for Radical Death Studies, and working with Dr. Cami Fletcher, thinking about, the sort of Black death, Black queer death, and the future of death. And so I think this is sort of what kind of fascinates me the most around VR technology, as someone who creates altars and memorials for the dead and dying, specifically for the Black dead and dying. I'm really curious about the future of Black death and how one might go about memorializing themselves inside of this space. I've been seeing a lot of information and news and videos just around how technology is really supporting a really interesting futurity around how people die and continue in the afterlife. So I imagine myself as a kind of tree, maybe in my grandchildren's home, and they can kind of engage with my DNA and my avatar or images of my digital assets. I hope to pass along to them, that they can work with this archive in a way. So that's a particular interest that I'm taking from this work, is this concept of memorializing. And so this led me also to create a zine that I called Chameleon, a survival Chameleon, a syllabus for survival. And so this is sort of a look inside of that zine, featuring some of the collaborators, Mayfield Brooks. We were working on Chameleon in Johannesburg. I called it Chameleon, the Joburg installments at the time. This was 2019. And so this is, Mayfield. I was also thinking a lot around the work of Audre Lorde and her concept of the biomythography as a kind of Black, queer, feminist genre or container that could hold the multiplicity that this project was attempting to bring forward. And so, sort of parenthetically, or oppositionally, or maybe sort of these subcurrents that were also operating alongside the Chameleon project were Radical Reimaginings and the Deluxury Project. Radical Reimaginings was a weekly emotional aid group that met. It was an international ensemble of predominantly artists, queer artists from all over the world. And we met via Discord as a way to check in, to sort of to maintain community, and to support each other through a very difficult time. And so we kept doing these sessions weekly for close to 2 years. And then there was the Deluxury Project. To remind you, this was 2020. I thought I was going to die. I didn't expect to live beyond this moment. So I was also deeply invested in the creation of this memorial. As someone who has had to bury many of my family members without any sort of understanding of what they wanted, what their wishes were, it felt really important to start creating a document, and I called it the Deluxury, that would give people the information that they need to remember me the way that I would want to be remembered. So the way that I sort of designed my server, I broke it into these different channels. We had a welcoming station, an abolition chat, awakening station, memory chat, community texts and images, then the Radical Reimagining chat was more, locked. And so, this is how I went about organizing this particular server. And these chat channels became sort of ways of organizing and inviting certain community members into particular conversations that they were interested in. And here's another. Okay, and so though there's this ongoing concern with convening, and particularly the convening through difference, what it means to convene through difference. And I think that's another part of the sort of virtual space that I find particularly interesting, is the way that a body can be reimagined, can be re-rendered. I could be a green alien if I want, or a toad or whatever. So it becomes a kind of opportunity to shed a skin and maybe take on another skin. And so another concept that I was thinking through is this idea of pigeon and pigeonization. A pigeon or a pigeon language is grammatically a simplified means of communication that develops between two or more groups of people that do not share a common language. Typically, its vocabulary and grammar are limited and often drawn from several different languages. And I've been particularly interested in the work, the forthcoming work, or maybe it's already been published, of Bonaventure So Beijing in Dikong, who has written a really interesting proposal around curatorial practice and method, and what it means to sort of use this pigeonization concept as a way of world building and thinking through the world. He says, what Pigeon does with its endless agency is a subversion of the colonial languages and indeed other languages from which it is constituted. Pigeon is always more than a sum of its parts, much faster in its development than the languages from which it feeds, and is far more accommodating. Fundamentally, Pigeon is not a language, but a way of being in the world. And so I'd love to just share a little bit of this sort of language, this new language that we were creating. Again, I was working with a international group, a global group of artists from Helsinki to South Africa to New York City. And so as a means of trying to produce another kind of language or another way of communicating, this idea of pigeonization sort of rose up in our practice. And so what I want to share here is you're going to hear, hopefully, you will hear some of the undertones of this sort of the pigeon vocalization. Maybe you'll hear it, maybe you won't. Okay, you will not hear it because this button is not working.
Stank.
Oh, it is working.
Weeks after my uncle finished dying in the summer of 1992, the death fumes he left a particular scent in the walls of his vacant bedroom, lingering in the cracks and corners, settling like pus inside the tiny bumps beneath the skin of the eggshell-colored paint. Even the floorboards stank of his demise, and so we kept the door shut, as if the room might clean itself, rid itself of the piss-stained mattress, the pneumonia, the diarrhea, the vomit-stained mattress, all the viral signals of a body having rejected itself. A skeleton of himself, sores the size of silver dollars opening their fluid-filled mouths, voiceless hymns rising from the choirs of his body. Most days he'd lay silent, reeking with guilt, perhaps retracing his steps, perhaps a footprint. Once he told me, the past will always leave a footprint. No sunlight, no visitors, sleep without rest. For nearly a year, he sat quarantined in that house.
Okay.
You stank.
Oh, okay. You may have heard it back there. It's quite faint, the pigeon sounding that's occurring, but it's behind the text. It's holding the text in a way. And so this is an image of the live presentation in development in Sweden. And so another sort of way in which I had to figure out working was, doing this project in so many different locations globally where none of the conditions were consistent. That was another mode of creation that I had to sort of negotiate and figure out what was this trying to teach me. And this is us performing in South Africa. And here is an image from the film Chameleon, a visual album. I won't be showing that, but I love this image. And I love also this excerpt from Fred Moten's Blackness and Nothingness, The Mysticism in the Flesh, where he writes, Blackness is the unoriginal displacement of ontology, ontology's underground, the irreparable disturbance of ontology's time and space. Which is to say that there's a way in which Blackness, it predates this concept of ontology. You don't get to ontology without having to undergo a sense of Blackness in the world. And so that's something that I find really interesting. A monograph that has been released the book last year, around this time last year, Black Body Amnesia, which serves as a kind of archive of the entire Chameleon universe, if you will, as well as other projects. And so this is a conversation with the curator, Ashley Foro Murray, via Zoom in the summer of 2020. And she writes, you were in the midst of these two significant back-to-back productions with rigorous international touring schedules, and you seemed ready for a shift to moving image, both on a conceptual and on a practical level. Ready for a change in practice. We began with the desire to make a film. 3 years later, COVID necessitated that you centralize the moving image material. And that is exactly what happened. And so here is just some of the analytics from the performance after having transitioned everything onto Discord. It just sort of goes through some of the places of engagement: New York, California, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Illinois. So these are from spaces predominantly in the US. Keep going. Internationally, we also had presence in Canada, Germany, UK, Sweden, South Africa, Finland, Israel. The predominant age group seemed to be 35 to 44, whatever that, women tend to gravitate to my work far more than men. So that didn't really surprise me. Yeah. And so here are just some images. This is taken from the zine, and this is an image of Chameleon in Stausenhagen, Germany, in the forest, in the garden rather. So literally going from so many different terrains, from a garden to a desert. I was trying to figure out how this project really wanted to materialize and be in the world. And so here is a video just to give you a little sense of the work. I want to fast forward through it. I won't show the whole thing. Just FYI, I'm going to try to fast forward through it.
Effigy. Was it Tina or Peaches? One of my mother's vindictive personalities who set the house on fire with her brother still in it. When I went to visit him in the burned victims unit, the doctors had just finished ventilating his lungs. The hours hung, long around his muscular melted frame like a bandage, Medical devices worked electric magic to keep him alive.
Okay, so that's just a little bit from the film Chameleon, a visual album. As I mentioned earlier, Black Body Amnesia is the book that sort of encapsulates, many of my projects right now as a kind of monograph, and just offers a sort of deeper look through images, through text, songs, etc. A deeper look into my work. That was a quick, down, dirty version, but that is Chameleon.
Thank you, Jaamil, so much for these beautiful insights, and thank you again, Sarah and Kent. And Jaamil, maybe to start with you, because I was wondering that after all the digital tools and social media and virtual spaces we have been talking about are almost all highly commercialized. They are corporate, privately owned platforms. And you are aiming for spaces that allow healing, care, that are safer spaces, etc. So you mentioned, for example, the way how everybody can create their avatars as they like, so that that skin, etc., is not a marker anymore as a possible empowering feature. But in how far do you believe does the digital realm actually offer a progressive or maybe even utopian potential in creating a different society? What does it offer that the analog world does not offer? And what would you see as the downside or maybe dangers of that?
I mean, personally, I would say the downside is just the sheer fatigue of engaging with screens, and I am very much I tend to be more of an analog individual in a digital world, and so I'm always having to negotiate my life through these various sort of interfaces. I would say that in 2020 and since then, I've been fortunate enough to create some incredible community and to be in conversation with folks that otherwise I would not be able to convene with. And I think much of this world, this sort of virtual world or worldings that have occurred, creates opportunity for folks with the right tools to be able to convene safely and really get the sort of information and support that they need. I started a process of what I call virtual doulaing during the pandemic, and that's become really, I mean, essentially, it's, I guess, another way of thinking about it is just, being sort of emotional tech support. But this concept of virtual doula really rose out of the pandemic in this work I was doing in radical reimagining. And so that's been something that has become a kind of hybrid model of care where even in my, if I'm doing a live show, Black Body Amnesia, as an example, is a touring production. I cast in a virtual doula to help, as a performer in the work. So these are ways in which I'm kind of playing with virtual reality and augmented reality, bodies that are present, that are heard but not seen, and the sort of hybridity that is able to be realized, I think, in this incredible moment.
This question of the ultimate potential of VR is actually a question I've asked all of my interviewees, and I've done over 2,000 interviews now. Yeah. And I gave a talk at South by Southwest where I gave like an overview of those answers of the ultimate potential. And that it was a 45-minute presentation, so I'm not going to be able to like give a gist of like all the different ranges. But I would say that, one thing is that in that talk, I try to map out all the different domains of human experience and all the different, whether it's education or into realms of medicine or entertainment or work and productivity and identity and new modes of economic exchange. So for each of those different contextual domains, though, there's the potentials and there's the perils. And so in my talk, you can look it up on South by South on YouTube. There's a South by Southwest talk where I gave the ultimate potential of VR. Also, my episode 1000 is a 3-hour exploration of all those potentials and perils into more of a long form format. And at Evolve Virtual, I just gave an abbreviated talk, which was just the perils, which was just the ethical and moral dilemmas of XR. And that was a 15-minute talk just to kind of go over all those. I'd say the highlight of that is that, the most of the stuff is going to be able to be handled through either some combination of technology, architecture, or cultural changes that have to happen, and that there are a small subset of these issues that are going to require new legislation, specifically privacy, and what happens with our biometric data. Our, Anita Farahani has a book called Battle for Your Brain, which is all about how neurotechnologies are going to be able to synthesize all this biometric and physiological data and start to violate our mental privacy, our freedom of thought, and our self-determination. And what she says, we need to define a new human right of cognitive liberty to start to address some of these different issues where the neurotechnology is going to be encroaching onto our privacy. So that's sort of like the issues of privacy are probably the biggest area where we need new legislation and new guardrails, because we're kind of sleepwalking into this dystopia where we have all these new modes of collecting all this data and what's happening to that data and what kind of inferences are going to be made around us.
I mean, maybe to go in one direction and to address this to you, Sarah, because you also mentioned already that the design of an environment shapes also to a large degree what is possible. So when we talk about the potential of artists, for example, to imagine different worlds, to create a kind of utopian or alternative or whatever thinking, how much space in these environments is actually there, and how much do these environments, but also the protocols, etc., already replicate certain procedure structures and so on of the analog world? What is your experience with that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it hits on something I'm super passionate about, which is I think that a lot of technology is being built to kind of, I don't know if the term, technological determinism is a familiar one to this audience, but sort of the idea that there's this kind of one mono direction that technology kind of needs to move, and we are fulfilling it at all costs. And I feel that that's kind of capitalism run wild with technology. And a lot of the technologies that we see being developed today are really reflecting and reproducing the ideologies of the world that they're built within. So for example, efficiency or productivity or things that are frankly not ecosystemic centric, human centric, but have to do with this kind of bottom line of these tech companies a lot of the time. At the same time, like Jaamil, I was thinking about, I love that you showed a Discord chat during your talk. I was like, someone needs to be archiving those emergent Discord spaces that happened during the pandemic that led to social action that really do speak to these kind of values driven, human centric, or I don't want to say human centric because I'm an ecosystems oriented person, but let's say life centric design, right? And I think that there are all of these opportunities where if we're really cognizant about both what is being put into the design of these systems and also paying attention to the effects that they have on us, that we can shift them to sort of, reflect values that, individuals or ecosystems or, that are desirable versus harmful or extractive. But I think it's very, very hard because there's so much marketing, there's so many stakes in sort of advancing this agenda forward of we have to see the next big headset. There's these quarterly reports on this many things happen and that many things happen. And frankly, there's not a lot of time to check in with what were the actual impacts of this and do they meet anybody's needs or desires? So even though I think my work, I tend to approach that in the most silly, absurd way. And a big part of that is trying to be a Trojan horse in these tech spaces, get myself in the door so I can sort of be hey guys, what the fuck are you doing right now? I don't think utopian is the right word, but I think that shifting ourselves towards desirable futures with these technologies is something that takes an active effort. Let's put it that way.
And I wonder, I mean, of course, come from theater and performing arts, I find it also interesting that, Kent, you were a lot addressing, of course, immersive environments. And I would say Discord is maybe far away, the furthest away from well, let's say it's a different kind of immersion, but from this kind of immersive environments. And I was wondering, you know, like in terms of theater, I have a big skepticism towards immersive theater works, because especially when it comes, I mean, with an interest into more political works, and that kind of goes back, and I mentioned it very briefly in the very beginning, to this dispute that already Stanislavski and Brecht would have, that Brecht would say, if you create a world where in the immersive world, you create a world where you cannot really influence it. That would be maybe the question, because often immersive worlds pretend to be participative, or a lot of these environments, not only the immersive environments, pretend to be participative, but actually you can only follow a certain path. So your participation is extremely limited. So in a way, it's maybe, I would say, it's even worse than not participating. It's like, because you're in a fake participation, and so you're not. Yeah, a lot of people say with this kind of work, being forced to participation is a problem. I would say the problem is being forced into a fake participation. And the question of immersive worlds for me very much is, can you find out how they are constructed, because they are meant not to see the construction, while in other works, and that would be maybe the Brechtian approach, is like you see how things are made. So that's also, and that's a way you see how the structure is made in a way, and that's a way maybe to intervene, at least in an optimistic view, that you could change things in there. So I was wondering a little bit about the idea of immersiveness versus participation in the works that you all talked about tonight.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, since I was covering a little bit more of the immersive theater scene in VR, I was talking about how, you know, in the more virtual spaces, there's more opportunity to have like branching narratives where you actually have a little bit more agency, where your choices are actually changing the way that the story is unfolding. When you have like an immersive theater production, you can't really necessarily take feedback from the audience and sort of finely tune into completely different directions, unless it's like more of a one-on-one interaction. Some of the pieces that I've seen, like TM, where it's over Zoom and it's more of a one-on-one interaction. So, but as you scale up, how does the degree of agency actually influence degrees of like the way that the story unfolds? I think that's just it's a hard problem, and it's like, it goes beyond, I guess, like, you know, collective action down into something that's making it feel like you're making a shift. I'd say that, you know, generally when you're watching, you know, there's a Robert McKee quote that says that when you are watching a story, it's about seeing a character and they're making choices and taking action, and it's revealing part of their essential character. But when you're in an immersive theater piece, you have more of this potential where the choices that you're making are revealing a part of your essential character. So it's about this part of you becoming a part of the story. And the piece that I showed called The Collider does that in a brilliant fashion, because it's exploring dimensions of boundaries and power asymmetries. And so it's putting you into this constructed, contrived situation that is getting into these essence of like, you are manipulating, controlling another person. And so what's it mean to basically be in this position of asymmetry of power? And then they break it down afterwards. But before you even start the experience, you're asked to recall a memory when you've exerted power over someone, or someone's exerted power over you. And so you're kind of using the memory of someone, you're putting them in this contrived situation that's a context that is totally in the theatrical performative way, but it's able to still tap into the dimensions of your own direct experience. And you are a character that's making choices and taking action in the context of that piece, that then is revealing a part of your character that you can reflect upon in that piece at the end of it. So I do think that there's, in some of these different virtual contexts, a little bit ability to explore more of that agency that is directed towards that. And in terms of political context, there was a piece that I just saw that recreated some of these different protests that were happening at, I think it was one of the World Economic Forums, or one of these things where it was in Canada, where they basically put people into a prison cell for like 48 or 24 hours, and basically what you walk through the step by step what this person went through, and you're able to kind of reimagine what it would be like to actually go through this experience. And so I think there is this sense of embodiment, even though I'm not making choices that's changing how the thing's unfolding. I was able to empathize what it would be like to go to a protest and basically be put in this prison cell that's over, has too many people, not enough water, and it is able to kind of recreate this political dynamic. So anyway, I think there's a lot of opportunities of using those core ingredients of embodiment, emotional immersion, your agency, and the different ways that you have these social dynamics that are like in these immersive contexts that I've seen. At least those are kind of those key ingredients that are, either you're a ghost and you have no agency, or you actually have a direct impact for how the story unfolds. And there's a spectrum of different ways that the story structures are being emerged, both in the immersive theater and the virtual context.
I guess the thing that I'm hearing that's kind of interesting is how often, these technologies are just, it's like a really Marshall McLuhan kind of statement to make, but they're just extensions of things that already exist, right? So sometimes they're meant to emphasize things, and sometimes they can sort of reproduce different kinds of, or produce different kinds of behavior or intentions. But at the end of the day, like to take them away from like interactions that you might have in like the so-called real world, I think is like a false approach. What I think the core of what you're saying, Florian, that's super interesting, this idea that like, how much of the artifice do you show versus how much of the kind of like direct engagement? Is that kind of what you mean by this like Stanislavski versus like Brechtian? Is that like a sort of a too reductive? Or I think it's quite interesting because VR is like, it's all about like, you have to sort of create like a fake body for yourself, or you have to decide not to, or you're living in a world that's like 100% artifice. But that question still exists like in any interaction that we have. Like, are you putting on like a front when you have a conversation? Like, do you have like a kind of personality that you're sort of inhabiting? And so once you start to think of them in terms of kinds of interactions or kinds of like performance acts that you might already be doing in reality, it becomes easier to analyze like how they might exist in these digital technological contexts.
I think the way in which we use these technologies, they are they're tools, and they're only as strong as those that are designing them, creating them. So I find it most interesting when there's a sense of hybridity that's being activated, or multiplicity rather, that's being activated. So the digital is only one sort of spoke or sphere inside of a much larger sort of container of worlding that sort of bleeds and blends aspects of theatricality, reality, digitality. I find that to be the most dynamic right now. And I would also just I want to see more people of color in this space, more women, because essentially, the more folks that are designing these conceptual realities, the more that they can also, make them more equitable, ideally, and be able to raise certain issues to the light that need to be seen and observed, as much in the digital space as is in our everyday lives, walking the earth.
Thanks. I think since it's getting here, it's really getting late where I am, but it's like we already spent a lot of time. So Jaamil, I would take this as beautiful last words for this session. There are many things we didn't touch upon that should be discussed. Maybe we meet another time. I think like the question of identification in terms of historic events that you mentioned, Kent, I would, from a Brechtian standpoint, would also be quite skeptical about. That would take another hour of discussions, I guess. The question we didn't address, we could have talked about, I think, is commitment. There's an idea, an old-fashioned idea, I think, in theater and the performance, that you commit to an event where you cannot easily disappear. I mean, you can go, but that's a statement, for example, or you can fall asleep. That's also a statement. So what does it mean that in many, not in all of these environments, there's a different way of getting out, getting a glass of wine, or just reading a book parallel. There are many aspects that would be interesting to discuss. So that's for other episodes. I thank you so much for really inspiring talks and ideas and insights into your work. And thanks everybody for joining here or on other channels. Thanks to Max and Onyx for making this possible again. And would be great to see you or if, in some other context, if you want to follow the Art of Assembly. We will talk hopefully also about virtual worlds again, but also a lot of analog gatherings as well. Thanks so much.